afternoon, good morning to some of you, good evening to some others. It is an honor for me to introduce the fourth keynote speaker of our conference, presenting also the fourth lecture in our EHMH lecture series, Professor Maria Pia Donato. Professor Donato is a historian who has taught at several Italian universities before joining in 2013 the Institute for Modern and Contemporary History in Paris as a CNRS research professor. She teaches the history of medicine at the École Normale Supérieure and at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. Her research focuses on early modern cultural history, the history of medicine, and the history of science, especially in a Catholic context. Professor Donato publishes a lot in Italian, French, and English. He is, in other words, a truly European scholar, the ideal scholar to close the conference of the European Association of the History of Medicine. Her publications include the monograph Sudden Death, Medicine and Religion in 18th Century Rome, which was, by the way, shortlisted for the EHMH Book Award in 2015. And she also edited several volumes on topics that connect to the theme of the conference. And there is the recent book, Medicine and the Inquisition in the Early Modern World, and a French book, and I translate the title, Medicine and Religion, Competitions, Collaborations, Conflicts, a book which exactly explores the central theme of this conference and which really also helped us thinking about the theme of this conference. Today, Professor Donato will do the same. I will explore the same topic with a view to a more specific theme, death and dying, with a lecture entitled Medicine and Religion at the Deathbed, Reflections on Death, Dying, and the Doctors in Early Modern Europe. Professor Donato, thank you so much for having accepted our invitation. It is an honor for us that you want to close the conference and lecture series. Before giving you the floor, I just want to inform the audience that the lecture itself will be recorded. Maria Pia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kat, and thank you all for being here, especially on a Friday night, and without the prospect of a drink together afterwards, which is even more courageous. I would like to thank you, the organizers, for inviting me, and especially Kat Wills. And I'm honored to be here among you, if only virtually. And it is also a very difficult task to say anything meaningful after such a wonderful conference. And please also excuse my accent, and I'll get started if I can. Sorry, just share my screen and presentation. Sorry, I would like to. Okay, here it is. Okay,
perfect.
Thank you. So I get started. In 1571, a prominent physician in Venice, Antonio Secco, was denounced to the state inquisitors for letting a patient die without the sacraments. Since the Fifth Lateran Council of 1215, sick persons must take confession before embarking on medical treatment. In 1566, Pope Pius V, the Pope Inquisitor or the Inquisitor Pope, tightened the obligation through the bull Super Gregem, which strictly forbade doctors from treating anyone after 3 visits unless they had taken confession. As Alessandra Celati has recently demonstrated, Secco's was one of many similar Inquisition proceedings regarding the end of life. As early as 1558, the Bishop of Venice requested practitioners to abandon unrepentant patients, but the local College of Physicians refused to comply. Over the years, the inquisitors filed accusations against practitioners, most of which, however, and this is the most important point probably, languished in the archives like secrets. From time to time, the college reminded doctors of their duties through circular letters. Judicial records contra medicos encapsulate different aspects of the early modern history of medicine and religion at the deathbed. On the one hand, they indicate that the Counter-Reformation Church bended the balance of power, at least in Italy, reinforcing rules of conduct that implied the subordination of the former to the latter. On the other hand, however, they point at the discrepancy between norm and reality. In actuality, medical practitioners developed multiple strategies to cope with professional dilemmas while taking part in the Christianization of death. Death and the doctors in early modern Europe is the topic of my talk today. It is surely not an original topic, and yet I felt, I discussed this with Kat when organizing the conference, when choosing the topic, that it might deserve some historiographical reflections, echoing many interesting papers that we heard over these 3 days. As you all know, death became a critical object in the 1960s. At that time, the social sciences and humanities turned to investigate it in historical perspective, prompted by changing patterns of dying and burial and momentous breakthroughs in surgery. I am, of course, referring to CPR and organ transplant, and the changing definition of death from a heart to a brain criterion, as well as an increased hospitalization of the terminally ill and the first hospices and palliative care units. Among historians, the most influential was surely Philippe Ariès, who, by the sheer ambition of his chronology, set the stage for 2 generations of scholars. Over the years, an incredibly vast body of scholarship has delved into the demography, learned and popular conceptions of death, ars moriendi, funerary and mourning practices, and cemeteries. Around the same time, the 1960s, historians of medicine also engaged with death. They concentrated on the origins of medical, legal, and ethical problems like the obligation to prolong life. It should be noted that back then, history of medicine was taught overwhelmingly in medical curricula. Still today, much literature is addressed to medical students and professionals. Broad introductions to medicine and religion are particularly valued in the US, where health services are largely confession-based. As many in this conference have highlighted, issues like the definition of death still pose dramatically concrete questions to practitioners, administrators, ministers, and of course, the families. In recent years, valuable studies, mostly focused on Germany and England, saw the light too, including an excellent book by Michel, who has the merit of moving beyond texts and examine practices. Stolberg, however, only treats religion tangentially. In this regard, the master narrative is still more or less the one shaped by Ariès, positing a linear evolution from a sacred and community-centered culture of death to an individualized, medicine-centered one. Secularization is deemed to take off in the late 18th century. Although indisputably correct, this narrative seems to me too broad to open new research avenues on early modern medicine and its interplay with religion, as this conference is trying to do. Today I will briefly touch upon different aspects, questioning the use of ecclesiastical sources, particularly in Catholic Europe. And in order to move a step away from a story that is still exceedingly focused on their opposition, as many of you have pointed out already, I will put some emphasis on the reciprocal enhancement of medicine and religion, both intellectually and socially. Where there are three physicians, there are two atheists. The medieval dictum went, and indeed, mistrust and suspicion were the keynotes of the attitudes of clerics vis-à-vis doctors. Let us go back to the obligation to call the priest for confession for a start. Unsurprisingly, the clergy were stern. Physicians must obey church decrees unconditionally, warned the Dominican friar Bartolomeo d'Angelo, whose Ricordo di Ben Morire went through no less than 21 editions. While Somascan Omobono de Bonis wrote that doctors would commit mortal sin if they passed over calling the sick to contrition or failed to warn them of the risk of death and damnation. But did physicians comply, and most importantly, did they do so out of scruples? Things were, of course, more nuanced. First, medical deontology was far from unanimous. To be sure, some authors took on the task of translating ecclesiastical injunctions into medical ones and were even stricter than some theologians. So one of these was Giovanni Battista Codronchi from Imola in central Italy, according to whom there was no excuse whatsoever for not calling the priest ever. According to Juan Alonso de Fontesa, professor at Alcalá de Henares in Spain, talking the sick into confession was the fourth thing to do upon entering their house. Confession was beneficial in soothing the soul, hence the body, but doctors must stop treating them if they refused, for the simple reason that the church required it. Still, the majority went only as far as saying that physicians should prompt gently their patients to call the priest. Indeed, calling the priest for confession, and even more for the extreme ointment, implied being able to prognosticate impending death. Something that, as all ancient and medieval authorities had warned, was one, inherently difficult, and two, professionally dangerous. Therefore, Paolo Zacchia, among others, Zacchia was the proto-medicus, the chief physician of the Papal States and one of the most influential authors in early forensic medicine, advocated judiciousness and appealed to the practitioner's discernment. On the one hand, physicians must persuade patients to receive the sacrament, but on the other hand, they should always refrain from disclosing pessimistic prognosis. Ultimately, anyway, doctors could not abandon sick persons even if they refused confession. But can historians have any insight on what happened in practice? Arguably, clerical insistence on this point is per se a clue. On this slide, you can see a very non-exhaustive list of provincial synods reinstating superdirection. Notably, at the end of the 17th century, Pope Innocent XI called bishops for greater vigilance and ordered the bull to be reprinted every year. Civil authorities reinforced the ordinance too. For example, the governor of Austria in 1779 and the emperor himself in 1812. Alessandro Pastore has documented that how most professional colleges in Italy eventually included some norms relating to the sacraments in their statutes. Early modern confessional statecraft did not solely imply control and subordination. It also established favorable conditions on the medical marketplace and social order at large. Trials like those in Venice offer some evidence. After all, as I have indicated, the College of Physicians did defend their independence and refused to sanction individual practitioners. Years ago, Jesuit historian Giacomo Martina wrote an article on medicine and religion in Pisa in the 1850s. The bishop asked parish priests whether physicians complied with their canonical duties. Answers varied greatly, as you can see here on the slide, and yet no one mentioned physicians giving up on recalcitrant patients. Interestingly, some priests highlighted that doctors behaved according to the social status of patients. And I tend to think that their early modern predecessors did quite the same. Mining the archives of local inquisition tribunals and diocesan archives might prove interesting in the future. As a matter of fact, with some exceptions like David Gentilecore already in the 90s, diocesan archives have been surprisingly neglected by historians of early modern medicine. Also, admittedly, they are not always easily accessible to scholars. But then again, rather than focusing on the conflict between doctors and priests, as Martina still did, I think we could use those records to probe into the attitudes of lay people towards both doctors and priests, as well as to question how medicine and religion combined in underpinning social order through differentiated ways of managing death. This brings me to another question. Did calling the priest mean that the doctor left? On this point, recent scholarship has challenged the traditional view, and I myself have changed my mind. Of course, the overwhelming majority of men and women died with no medical care at all, and if they did, doctors usually withdrew at the final moment out of dignity and humility, and possibly also because they had to attend other paying patients. The duty of physicians to assist their patients until the end was anyway commonly acknowledged in early modern ethics. This was a point in which Christianity marked some difference with antiquity. The love of Jesus should inspire Christian healers in comforting the sick. As Leonardo Botallo, surgeon to Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, put it, charity and kindness are excellent medicines. Yet the terminally ill posed grave professional dilemmas. Needless to say, an expectant attitude was predominant in Western medicine. The so-called Hippocratic triangle, the sick person, the disease, and the doctor, in the Hippocratic triangle, medicine was conceived as support for the sick in the fight against illness. Hence, medicine must imitate the healing powers of nature with a full awareness of its own limitations. And that was the obvious limit of medicine's scope. Numerous writings, however, especially those addressed to students, were much cruder. Not only agony was extremely unpleasant, but it could harm one's reputation if too many died in one's care. Both refusing to treat serious cases and prescribing them medicines could prove professionally dangerous. It should be noted that reputation was crucial on the early modern medical marketplace, yet not as much as in antiquity, when no formal qualifications existed. So we should be wary of attributing to religion something that did, in fact, largely depend on the corporate organization of medical practice. In order to move a step away from the cliché of the conflict at the deathbed, I suggest that religious sources be reconsidered. In his study of Lutheran Leichenpredigten, Kernel Kümmel noted that positive remarks associated with medicine were frequent and theologically based, insofar accepting treatment implied not being in a state of sin, which is also true for Catholics, as we have seen. Moreover, it was not uncommon for sermons to praise the spiritual comfort offered by physicians until the very end. Of course, sermons are normative texts, and yet they disclose that people did not die as they ideally should have. Seriality enables historians to see deviations. And I suggest that Catholic eulogies and hagiography might too, as well as visual depictions of the scene of death. Indeed, allegorical how they are, images like this on the slide hint at a more complex reality. Canonization processes could prove interesting as well. It is hardly necessary to mention how rich miracle narratives are after Anne Harrington's wonderful keynote on Lourdes. To medievalists and early modernists, over the past decades, this type of source has disclosed the agency of common men and women in regard to health and sickness, and provided information about medical pluralism, while historians of religion have studied the place of physical pain associated with both illness and medication in the making of sainthood, a place that grew even bigger in modern Catholicism, as Tina von Oesterler argued in her talk yesterday. However, scholars have not systematically used processes and other related materials to track the presence of medics at the deathbed, nor ideas and practices related to death and dying, and the ways in which medical and lay cultures blended into each other in this regard. Let me give you just one example that I am familiar with, but there are so many many others that I could quote. Andrea Avellino was a cleric regular Theatine from southern Italy, mostly active in Counter-Reformation Naples. He died of apoplexy while officiating the Holy Mass in 1608. His beatification and later canonization processes include several miracles related to death, resuscitation, and resurrection. A close reading of testimonies and medical expert statements, as well as the would-be saints' lives that were produced to help the cause, provide insight on how death was experienced both by medics and lay people, and how they interacted. Are accounts like the ones that you can see on the slide veridical? I'm not sure this is the right question to ask. What I suggest is that sources related to sainthood are sites where different cultures of death, religious and medical, learned and popular, were negotiated. And because Avellino's two proceedings are separated by nearly a century, we can appreciate how death, and more specifically the medicalization of death, acquire a more prominent place over time, and how medical theory evolved and was put at work in vetting the natural and the supernatural. Whereas in early biography, physicians remained in the background, in later texts, reader can see them standing by Andrew on his deathbed until the end. And whereas his first biographer termed agony as the apparition of, I'm quoting, a tempting spirit in the form of an ugly man, late 17th century writers concentrate on his physical pain, on, I quote again, the frightening blackness and the horribly inflating visage, frantic gaze, and increasing breathlessness of his chest. I also add that we know very little of dying in early modern hospitals, which, as you know, were charitable institutions under some form of control by the church, direct or indirect control. Normative texts and the way in which historians use them focus on ecclesiastics, an essential duty of whom was offering spiritual assistance to moribund inmates and later a Christian burial, but basically keep medical staff out of the picture. The torments of medicine introduce a further question: the cures for the incurable and fatally ill. Incurable diseases and terminal illnesses were very different things in early modern medicine, ancient and early modern medicine. For the sake of time, I cannot deal with either. In ancient medicine, defining and accepting incurability had a triple stake: philosophical, medical, and professional. Obviously, all these drives remained very powerful in the early modern age, while religion added an extra layer of motivation, because, of course, Christians must accept divine will and trust in the afterlife. Hence, the Hippocratic no harm principle implied refusal of violent treatment, futile care, and experimental therapies, even in the most hopeless cases. The majority of medical authors agreed over these points across confessional divides. Of course, theologians preached the advantage of the medicine of the soul, of the bodily one, and inducing acceptance of sickness and death was the priest's very task, according to the official Rituale Romanum of 1614. Although refusing medical care was sinful, according to many canonists, even, I would add, in conversation with Tina von Esseler, for aspiring saints like Maddalena de Pazzi, but again, the list could be much, much longer. Interestingly, and I think that the circulation of medical knowledge among the clergy should be investigated in greater depth, clerics drew profusely upon medicine to argue the cause of faith. Clinically realistic descriptions were introduced in Asmoreandi literature. The feet get cold, the teeth almost black, the nose shut, the eyes are blind and moist, etc., wrote Jaime Montanes, a Catalan Carmelite, in 1588, in an obvious reference to Fascius Hippocratica. In actuality, hopelessness did not mean giving up treating. What we would now call palliative care was in fact considered a legitimate pursuit. Stolber has provided an excellent overview of such cures, and histories of incurable conditions like cancer do as well. Historians also agree that the market for health and beauty services expanded over the early modern age, including terminal illness. Ian Mortimer estimated the purchase of medical and nursing services in Kent through probate accounts and concluded that, I quote, the medicalization of serious illness over the 17th century involved the increased attendance of practitioners at the bedside. New research on childhood proves this point further. Classic Histoire de Mentalité posited that the loss of infants and children was accepted as inevitable in pre-modern societies. Historians of childhood, historians of religion, and more recently of emotions like Gillian Avery, Susan Bromhall, and others, have disputed such view, and likewise have historians of medicine like Hannah Newton in her beautiful The Sick Child in Early Modern England, and Claudia Pancino. Interestingly, in the late 17th century and 18th centuries, interestingly, the late 17th and 18th centuries saw a surge in writings dedicated to the care of the dying. These works are ambivalent. On the one hand, they argued for end-of-life treatment, but on the other hand, cures were in fact minimal nursing, like hydrating moribund drop by drop, instead of forcing food on them, which was, after all, what the pious Counter-Reformation doctors like Kodronki recommended when they rebuked costly and unnecessary cures. I should add that many authors, as you can see, were Protestants, so that some historians have suggested that pietism contributed to such a shift. I think that different factors were at play. For sure, this is an indictment that medicine was making death an integral part of knowledge and, to an extent, practice. True, Catholic physicians, especially in the Italian and Iberian peninsulas, refrained from publishing on topics that might catch the eye of censors. They usually stuffed the academic genre of compendia with new controversial ideas. But the spectacular rise of universities in the German territories in the 17th and early 18th centuries is per se conducive to such developments, regardless of Protestantism. Nonetheless, I would say that religion did play a role. Histories of medicine and religion tend to assume a degree of equitable access to ministers of both, which is surely not true for Renaissance Europe. But it was less untrue for a century later, and by the end of the 17th century, church authorities, both Catholic and Reformed, considered society to be largely Christianized and disciplined. It is not by chance that, as I have indicated, the late 17th century witnessed a revival of artes moriendi and ecclesiastic regulation. So in short, although we lack a cross-thematic overview, I would say that an increased medicalization and an increased professionalization combined in making death a more prominent theme. This brings me to a third point, well, my topic in a way, sudden death and resuscitation. This is an aspect in which I think the influence of religion on medicine can indeed be demonstrated, whereas the traditional narrative credited the emergence of modern interventionism to the Enlightenment at the end of the 18th century. In fact, sudden death emerged as a fully fledged medical subject, both in Catholic and Protestant contexts, in the late 17th century. Apoplexy, a traditional disease of the head, also elicited new interest. And this is, of course, connected to contemporary research in the anatomy of the brain and the physiology of the nerves, and more generally to a post-Cartesian understanding of sensation and movement. But it is nonetheless worth noticing that the emphasis falls on resuscitation. In all writings, the clinical stance on and the religious implications of sudden death are the prime focus. Of course, arguing that sudden death could be avoided was not a totally new argument, obviously not, but physicians and surgeons now moved beyond a century-long expectant attitude, and this happened in the particular case of a spiritually dangerous way of passing. This new stance I posited in my book some years ago, which Kat had the kindness of recalling, is indeed tightly connected to rigorism in theology and piety. A major phenomenon in the late 17th century was a shift on the subject of salvation and contrition. I cannot enter into details, but the renewal of Augustinianism entailed a rising fear of not gaining valid sacraments on the deathbed. More precisely, if we are to set a turning point in the history of medical attitudes toward death, we must look at papal Rome, and one book in particular, the Subitanes Mortibus, by the papal physician Giovanni Maria Lancisi. This book is a milestone in the modern understanding of death as a process, and in a more active stance on the dying patient. For both, the religious background is crucial. For a Roman Catholic physician like Lancisi, prevention through a finer understanding of the mechanisms of death is the ultimate goal of medicine, while resuscitation is a medical and a religious issue at once. Doctors must try to resuscitate the dying, not least to give them the time to repent for the sake of their souls. Recently, Anton Serdeshny has claimed that the origin of resuscitation medicine is to be found in Protestant Switzerland in the 1730s. I stick to my interpretation, but the point here is that closer scrutiny of theological debates in their technicalities can gain us a finer understanding of early modern medical culture. The last point I would like to briefly address is active euthanasia, an impervious field for early modernists. In a groundbreaking article of 1969, Rodolfo Graziani unearthed a 16th century report describing the means used by laypersons to end agony. More recently, Stolberg brilliantly reinterpreted practices that were long mistaken for acts of devotion, like laying the dying on bare ground, and were in fact murderous mercy, especially among the lower classes, to accelerate death. Theoretically speaking, medics were, of course, in the strictest obligation not to give any drug mortem vel retardantibus vel accelerantibus, which, like opium, I quote from Ernest Struve in early 18th century, opens the door from which life escapes. Years ago, Roy and Dorothy Porter argued that the prescription of opium became a commonplace among the elite in the late 18th century. For sure, since antiquity, its properties were perfectly understood. And in the 16th century, for instance, Botallo, among others, argued that abortifacient drugs and opium should only be used if absolutely necessary. In the 17th century, well before the usual chronology, an increasing number of writings dealt with opium. Could casebooks and patient records shed new light on the actual use of sedatives? Or maybe household accounts and apothecary bills? Possibly. But I suspect we would at best find very indirect evidence. Still, what's wrong? Still, omission and self-censorship are historical problems per se, which I suggest deserve new consideration. How did physicians emotionally and philosophically confront death, the dying, the cadaver? In some ways, I think that the history of medicine is still underpinned by a binary understanding of faith. Dating back to the 19th century, when the nascent discipline unintentionally appropriated the clerical stance. Why do we assume that there were only two sorts of practitioners, the pious and the atheist, whereas the question is, how did they cope with their multiple identities? Do not take me wrong, please. Measuring the faith of anyone is beyond the historian's scope. And yet, we could use some fresh research starting on the Artes Moriendi written by physicians like Fabio Glicenti's Discorsi Morali of 1596. As Cindy Klestinek has recently argued, Glicenti's work is an integral part of the Counter-Reformation, but crafted a notion of the good death in which the physician, both as a Christian and as a philosopher, played a central role. Some historians have investigated how medical students now and then learn detachment. But I think there is still much to learn on how doctors and surgeons experienced and prepared for death. To conclude, historians live in the present, and all history is contemporary history. This is the truism on which our profession is built. Today, like in the past, we face challenges related to death and dying, and we will always face challenges. Controversy over end-of-life protocols is sparked by tragic cases again and again. Cases like those of Terry Schiavo, Elwan Anglaro, J. McMath, Vincent Lambert. Myself, I turned to investigate death while the case of Elwan Anglaro was attracting much, sadly, was attracting much public interest. Some months ago, Spain adopted new legislation on euthanasia for the terminally ill, and Belgium allows euthanasia for minors. In a recent poll in the UK, 2/3 were in favor of a new, more liberal bill, and their votes rage in France and Italy, where citizens are in this very moment petitioning for a referendum. Notably, in both countries, both Catholic, let's say, even if for France this would be incorrect, but let's say of Catholic traditions, the discretion of physicians over patients' advanced decisions is fiercely contested. And as a matter of fact, in postmodern societies, the authorities of both medicine and religion, is disputed in an unstable configuration of arguments. An allied phenomenon happened in the 1970s and was crucial in reshaping the history of medicine from the patient's vantage point, which could, I think, be matter for historians in itself. Meanwhile, the COVID pandemic has dramatically torn the veil on some incongruities between secular representation of death, I would say its concealment, and the rude realities of medicine at large. Triage for intensive care, for example, was propelled into the media sphere, generating huge misunderstandings. While the solitude of those dying of COVID reminded us that ideas of good death are still profoundly embedded in religious cultures. Somehow incongruously, however, society now demands medics to play different roles at the deathbed and meet conflicting expectations. Moreover, the pandemic has shown that Europe is certainly not homogeneous vis-à-vis religion as well as medical expertise, not least because some areas are more and differently multicultural than others. Hence, it is not surprising that historians wish to engage in public debate. It would be preposterous to claim that they can bring meaning to those who suffer, scare, and doubt. But I believe they can and should produce new scholarship without indulging in simplistic visions, which is, I think, paradoxically, a greater risk now that the media engage with such topics and solicit historical comparisons. I agree with Julie Marie-Strange that rather than pitching medicine against religion, it is more helpful to view both as non-static paradigms. Yet the question remains, how do we do this? I don't know. I have no answers, but I can maybe offer two reflections very briefly. I think that part of the answer, I had the opportunity to say that recently in another occasion, but I would like to repeat this. I think that part of the answer come from the history of medical practice, which cultural historians a la Ariès have largely overlooked, and we, historians of medicine, should carefully consider in order to break free from a national historical stance on death and on medicine and religion at large. A closer scrutiny of norms, practices, intellectual traditions, and genre can disentangle what seems to depend on some zeitgeist or mentalité and was in fact tied to institutions. For example, I quoted Botallo 2 times, and Botallo, and also like him, could be taken for a very lukewarm Catholic, and maybe he was. But the point here is that we should not overlook that this book is a comment on the Hippocratic text Decorum, aiming at extolling surgery. Second, and finally, I would say that we still need a greater degree of theological specification within a common Christian culture, especially for periods of rapid change such as early modern Europe. Sometimes historians of medicine lack a finely grained knowledge of religious debates, just as historians lack a finely grained knowledge of medical theory and practice. But there is no better way than enhancing the conversation among scholars of different backgrounds and fields of expertise, as this conference is doing, and is doing. And I therefore, once again, thank you all for being here and for the invitation. Thank you.